Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm joined here tonight again by Jonathan Pelto. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Who is going to talk primarily about the state of the state budget this year, which is not too good. But maybe we'll talk a little bit about what can be done as well.
Yep. Now is the time. The budget is supposed to be adopted by the Appropriations Committee. In fact, the day we're filming this, the Finance Committee is supposed to develop a tax package that balances that budget in a couple of days. And so by the end of this week, the state is supposed to have the outline of the budget that then goes before the State House and the State Senate. It's supposed to pass and be signed into law certainly by the beginning of June, even though it takes effect on July 1st. The news today was that they could not come up with the votes to adopt a budget, and that they didn't think that it would be likely that they would be able to come up with the votes to adopt a tax package. So while all eyes are turned to Washington and the potential shutdown of the federal government at the end of the week, in fact, the problems in Connecticut are just as severe, and the prognosis may be just as bad, if not worse. I think there's a lot of people who assume one way or another that enough people will blink that Washington won't be shut down, that the Republicans really don't have it in it, and it wouldn't be beneficial to them politically to have a shutdown of the United States government. And as crazy as they are, they're not that crazy now. Of course, we know they are that crazy.
They might be.
And so that they may end up shutting down the government. But the problems in Connecticut are severe, and unlike in Washington, where it really boils down to, in many respects, a philosophical debate, because the government can run a deficit and continues to run a deficit. And in fact, in Washington, D.C., all of this talk now of the Trump tax cuts would be financed on deficit spending. So the irony that the Republicans say they're fiscally responsible and yet want to now cut taxes without cutting spending, because they just want to.
It's almost like a return of the Reagan years.
It really is.
That the tax cuts were financed with,
with made up.
Yeah, and deficits for years to come.
Deficits, and now we have facing record deficits, and the Republicans say they don't want to do that, and yet they're about to do it again. But at the state level, of course, like at the local level, your revenue by the requirement, a constitutional requirement, has to meet your spending, or your spending has to have a revenue stream. And the problem is that Connecticut has had such poor financial management that every time they've had the opportunity to do the wrong thing, they've done the wrong thing, to the point that we just don't have a revenue stream that can fund the kind of government we have in place, or the kind of government programs that we need. And so now the day of reckoning has been put off and been put off because they used one budget gimmick after another, raided different funds, came up with different ways to balance the budget. All of those gimmicks have now been used, and so there's really no solution but to either come up with the revenue that the state needs, or to make such draconian cuts that the state would be unrecognizable. The Democratic Appropriations Committee add on to that the problem that the Senate is now split exactly down the middle, 18-18. So there's really, all you need is one Democrat to vote with the Republicans, and you keep a budget from passing. And in the House, there's only a 7-vote margin, and so again, all you need is a small group of people saying that they're not going to vote. Compounding the problem is that the Republicans can, in essence, have a free ride. They can say, as they have, that they will not vote for any taxes, trying to pander to people in Connecticut who obviously nobody wants to pay taxes.
Sure.
And so the Republicans are saying, we're not going to vote for a single tax increase, when in fact the revenue stream just doesn't come up with the kind of money that you would need. So the Connecticut is in a very difficult situation. The state budget is in a very difficult situation, and it looks like there's not going to be a solution anytime soon. And while they have until technically July 1st in order to adopt a budget, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see a budget in place until absolutely the last moment, or even into the beginning of the next fiscal year. I brought, as usual, some slides along to show you the kind of situation. And well, we start out, we've mentioned this before, but I think it's really important to mention it at the beginning and end of every conversation we have about budgets, because this is an area where the media coverage really trivializes the problem and allows people to say, well, we're overtaxed and therefore we shouldn't have any tax increases. And the fact is there are people that are overtaxed in Connecticut. Connecticut has a pretty regressive tax structure, and the middle class and the poor really are heavily taxed. The wealthy, quite frankly, are not. That this chart that is up on the screen makes it clear that those in the lowest income category, they pay about 12% of their income in state and local taxes. The middle class pay about 10% of their income in state and local taxes, and the wealthiest pay about 5%. So in the United States, we're taught that you should have a progressive tax structure, that the income tax is supposed to be a progressive tax. Now, at the federal level, it's probably not, but the debate of...
It was at one time, though, during the Eisenhower years, for example, and it was a period of huge growth.
And huge growth, and it was a progressive tax structure that the more you made, the higher percentage of your income you paid in taxes. Well, Connecticut now has a perfectly regressive tax structure. That is, the lower the percentage, the lower you make, the higher percentage of your income you give in taxes. And so, while quote unquote nobody wants to see taxes raised, there is a mechanism in Connecticut that we could come up with the taxes, that at the highest levels of taxation, in fact, we could raise our income tax by 2 percentage points, and they would still be paying significantly less than they pay in New York or Massachusetts, New Jersey, certainly less than they pay in New York. And so one of the things that you're hearing in the media these days is that, well, if the Democrats raise taxes, they'll be thrown out of office because nobody wants to have their taxes raised. And in fact, it sidesteps the question of there are people that aren't paying their fair share. And do we want as a society to say that everybody should be paying their fair share, or do we want to continue to coddle the rich in this state? And the argument that somehow they will get up and leave, the studies have shown that they're part of the community. There will always be a small percentage of people who will leave the state because of taxes, just like they'll leave the state for a variety of reasons. But the idea that that whole scale, the wealthy will leave Connecticut, we're the wealthiest state in the country. If we were our own country, we would be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. These are people who have their million-dollar mansions, their lives are closely connected to their communities. Will they get up and leave? The answer is the vast majority will not.
And honestly, moving from Greenwich to Westchester, they wouldn't end up paying less taxes after the move.
No, they'd end up paying more in taxes, right. And so this argument that if we raise taxes on the rich, if we ask the rich to pay their fair share, they'll all move to New York. Well, if they move to New York, they would be paying higher taxes. If they move to New Jersey, they would be paying higher taxes. If they move to Massachusetts, they'd be paying higher taxes. Now, it's true if they move to South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, they'd be paying lower taxes, and some people will do that. But in fact, most of them are working in New York, and they're driving into New York, and they're living in Connecticut, and they're benefiting from having lower taxes in place. But the magnitude of the problem, the latest numbers that are just coming in, the fact is that part of the problem here is that people just have not been telling the truth about the magnitude of the problem. And we could get lost in the numbers, but basically the shortfall, we have about a $20 billion budget, and the shortfall next year is going to be in the range of $2 billion. So it's a 10% shortfall.
Yeah, that's huge.
And this is not something where playing with the taxes a little bit, making a minor change will make the difference. We're going to have an honest assessment, an honest discussion between our elected officials and the electorate. And the electorate are going to have to understand by claiming that it's not a problem, they've been given the false sense that little things can change it. And so you hear people that say, just cut the budget. And the fact is that cutting the budget by 10% would have a devastating impact on a whole variety of things. We've already seen the institutions of higher education have been cut by 5%. And that's led to record increases in tuition and fees, and higher education now becoming so expensive that there are increasing numbers of people that just can't afford to go to college. And so the idea that simply cutting the budget, we can cut our way out of it, is just a false premise. And so...
And there are some obligations that are old obligations that we really are obligated to fulfill.
That's right. About half the budget is what are called fixed items. They're things that just simply cannot be cut legally because we have pension payments, or we have healthcare cost payments, we have debt service payments. So you're talking about in a budget of $20 billion, only about half of it can even be talked about. The other half just simply cannot legally be cut. So there we're talking about a 20% cut that would be needed in order to balance the budget. And as people think about their own lives, the idea of cutting their spending by 20%, one in every $5, is just not something that is doable in most of situations, and it's not doable here. So the question is, even if we were to engage in record cuts, you'd still have to be talking about significant tax increases. And the problem from the governor on down is that we've wanted to sugarcoat everything. Just last week, the governor's office put out a statement that said that we were going to end the fiscal year in a surplus. Well, in fact, since then, it's become apparent just in the last week that he just wasn't telling the truth. That's
Is there any kind of number to justify the statement?
No. In fact, it's really just that he's wanted to be a very, he's at record, he's the most unpopular Democratic governor in the country right now. Less than 30% of the people support him in the state of Connecticut. And so you want to tell people something that you think they want to hear, and instead of sitting people down and saying, look, we have a real problem. We do not have a revenue stream that will maintain a budget that we can live with. Now, we can make cuts, and here are some of the cuts that we can make, but there are few and far between the cuts that make sense, and therefore we're going to have to talk about taxes, and we're going to have to talk about who's going to pay those taxes. And so a $2 billion shortfall, I mean, to put this into perspective, when Malloy got elected in 2010, took office in 2011, he inherited what he called a record budget shortfall, and it led to a record tax increase, and he blamed that on Governor Rell and on the Democratic legislature for giving him a record budget deficit. That was $3.6 billion. The deficit that we're now facing is 4.2. So the fact is that over 7 years, the situation has gone from bad to worse. And so even though he has said that he has sort of settled the fiscal house, the fact is the fiscal house is in much worse shape than it was when he took office 7 years ago. That yes, we've had tax increases, and yes, we've had budget cuts, but they haven't made the kind of structural changes that they would need to make in order to have a government that functions from year to year. And part of that has been this effort to coddle the rich. And so I heard a reporter today say, well, the people who are talking about raising taxes on the rich are the Bernie Sanders type who just want to raise taxes. And the answer is...
That's a huge insult to
that's
start
an insult.
with.
That's right. That somehow that's an insult. The fact is that there are a whole lot of people that aren't paying their fair share. The Democrats have not been doing the right thing in Connecticut, and therefore part of the problem is the Democrats have controlled both the legislature and the legislative and administrative branches of government. We've had the governor and the legislature. And even with the Democrats holding both chambers and the governor's office, they have not set up a fiscal stream that allows government to continue. And that's really what caused the kind of problems that we're into now.
Am I correct in a memory that at one time Connecticut had a surplus?
Connecticut had significant surpluses, and the problem is we used up, it was called the rainy day fund, to be used when it was rainy. And we didn't use it when it was rainy, we used it when it was sunny, because what happened was as cost of government grew, and there was an agreement that those are the kinds of services that we should provide. Instead of raising the revenues to fund those services, we used up our rainy day fund. We used up our surplus to fill the gap. And when the problem got bigger, we swept different funds. And so one of my favorite examples was that almost 8 years ago, we put in a fee on when you when you got your license. And part of that fee was going to go to pay for school bus seatbelts. And so every year people have been paying that fee, and the money went into a fund that was supposed to pay for school bus seatbelts. 8 years later, it was an idea that was adopted, a bipartisan idea, adopted by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Republican governor. And why did they do that? There had been a bus accident in Hartford, and a child had been killed who they believed would not have died had there been seat belts on the bus. And so the legislature held a press conference, legislators held a press conference on the side of the road and said, we're going to come up with the money to put seat belts in school buses. And we're going to do that by having this fee on a driver's license. 8 years later, not a single seat belt has ever been put in, because what happened was every time that there was up to $4 or $5 million in this fund, Malloy and the legislature would sweep the fund and take the money to pay for non-seatbelt activities. They did that with every fund that existed. They did it with the Clean Water Fund. They did it with the Transportation Fund. They did it with the Insurance Fund. They did it with every fund that they could come up with. And so what happened was, between using the surplus and using these special funds, they didn't have to raise taxes. And they didn't have to raise taxes. They didn't have to deal with the issue that the wealthy weren't paying their fair share. And here we are now, this plan that is not coming together as they had projected, but the plan that the legislature was trying to put together up until the last couple of days, or up until today, and still theoretically that they're going to try to put together, has all different kinds of taxes that raise on middle and lower income people, but they continue to want to coddle and protect the wealthy. And these are the Democrats. The Republicans are saying no taxes whatsoever. The Democrats are saying we'll raise taxes, but we don't want to raise too much on the wealthy because
we don't want to punish them for their success.
We don't want to punish their success, right? So even this latest plan called for a 0.5% increase on the income tax. And as I said, we could raise the rate by 2% and they'd still be paying less. So what did the Democrats come up with? They wanted to raise the sales tax by almost a point to go to a 7% sales tax. Sales taxes are regressive. There are still large areas that are not even covered in the sales tax that could be covered in the sales tax. But they wanted to raise the sales tax rate. They wanted to add a new fee on all automobiles. They wanted to nickel and dime all these different little taxes in order to not have to deal with taxing the rich.
And of course, well, do you think that the legislature is not in enough of a sense of panic or desperation yet? Because, I was watching, I've been a proponent of legalizing recreational pot for a long time, not really so much for revenue purposes, but for equity reasons and science, but that didn't get out of committee, and yet everyone knows that it would have not solved the revenue problem, but been one more stream that would have helped a little bit.
And would have actually helped quite a bit. And it's one of those things where you're hard pressed to understand, with Massachusetts and Maine and other states shifting towards the legalization of marijuana and then taxing it. And
right. I mean, regulation is actually not a radical idea. It's sort of conservative to want to regulate these substances, right?
That's right. And we regulate and we tax alcohol at a high rate. We regulate and tax tobacco at a high rate. It's not as if we're not going to have recreational marijuana available. It already is available. It's going to be available even more. It's a question of time before Connecticut adopts it. But that's a perfect example of probably not feeling like we have to go to the drawing board and say, what are some of the ways that we could raise revenue besides raising taxes on the poor and middle class? And so They want to raise the tax on alcohol, they want to raise the tax on smoking, but then they turn their back on this legalization of marijuana for reasons that are outdated at best and ignorant at worst. The fact is that it would have raised, or it could raise, approximately the same amount as raising the sales tax. So if people do face a 1% increase in the sales tax, where everything is going to be taxed more,
Right.
the things that they need, you could have made up that difference, and it's true it wouldn't have solved all of the fiscal problems, but it would have been a big revenue item, simply to say that those people who want to use recreational marijuana should pay a tax that is similar to the kind of tax that they pay on smoking and alcohol. And so I think part of it is that people, that there's not a sense of urgency. Part of it is that the legislature themselves, like the governor, like elected officials, have wooed themselves into a sense of security, that the voters don't understand, that the voters, I think that they believe that voters are not sophisticated enough to make the decisions, and so therefore they fall back on that Republican mantra of just no taxes, period, thinking that somehow the overtaxed middle class working folks are going to feel like that position is acceptable, when in fact that they're seeing these wealthy people who are just not paying their fair share in taxes.
And also seeing an erosion of services. Last week, I think the Connecticut Commuter Rail Council met in New London, and commuter rail, they're talking about reducing service and raising fares. So many middle-class people use commuter rail, especially in this area, because so many of the jobs are west.
That's right.
And so it's going to be a tax on those same people if you're going to raise the rates that they have to pay to commute to work.
That's right. I mean, even the Democratic plan, which is not coming together, as I said, because they don't want to raise taxes on the wealthy. Even the Democratic plan calls for another 5% cut to all of the institutions of higher education, for example. So if you cut another 5%, and that means there's going to be another big round of tuition increases, that's a tax. It's a tax on people that are trying to improve themselves. It's a tax on people that are sending their kids to college. It's a tax on those that are trying to get a degree so that they can get a better job. It's a tax on those that have decided to go back to school so they can expand their skill set. It is as much a tax when tuition goes up as it is to say, so for the Republicans to say no new taxes is simply to say let somebody else pay. The next chart that I have put up on the screen are the places where, as I said, about half the budget is not, you can't legally cut. And so that leaves us with about half the budget where you can legally cut. So I've identified of $9 billion approximately where that is. We're already cutting a whole variety of services for the poor. We're cutting daycare, we're cutting services for the mentally ill, we're cutting services for those with developmental disabilities. Where else could we cut? So the first area, the largest area, is state employees. We spend $4 billion a year. So the idea, to show the magnitude of this problem, if we got rid of half of all state employees, which would end all kinds of services, of course, because the governor is now saying if he doesn't get a concession package, that he will lay off 4,000 state employees. Last year
Is this throughout all the departments?
Through all the departments. Last year he said he would lay off 2,000. They couldn't even get 1,000 layoffs without reducing services to the point that it just was not acceptable. So even Malloy, who last year said he was going to lay off 2,000, ended up laying off 1,000. This year he says he's going to lay off 4,000. There are just not 4,000 employees that could be laid off without doing such damage to services, because of course those state employees work in all across all different departments.
Yeah, thinking about like plowing highways in the snow, and the mental health system and the disabilities. It's just
Child and
amazing.
youth services and vocational high schools and colleges and universities and all of the different environmental protection. So the fact is that there's theoretically some savings in state employees, but this assumes no pay raises, and you'd still need $4 billion. So we need a concession package. The state needs a concession package. There will be some kind of a concession package. But the $4 billion assumes that the state employees already go without a pay raise. So that is a concessions package right there. And the Democrats are saying that they want something that's larger than that. The Republicans are saying they want something that's larger than that. So it's difficult to see where you would get the savings there. The second area is aid to cities and towns. And for every dollar that you cut, you're just going to increase local taxes.
So really, yeah, it makes little difference to the taxpayer.
That's right.
Where their money's going. And I think the cities and towns are kind of going crazy now because they're working on their own budgets and they don't know what they're going to get from the state. So it's just a lot of extra overhead and trying to plan what to do on a municipal level.
That's right. So we've got a governor and a legislature that have already made historic cuts to education, the deepest cuts in state history. The governor has proposed moving $400 million in pension payments onto the cities and towns. So that would be a $400 million increase in local property taxes. And the problem with local property taxes is it's a very regressive form of taxation. It's not based on your income, it's based on the value of the property. And that means middle class and poor people are going to be disproportionately hurt. Wealthy communities they have so many wealthy properties, they don't have to tax as high.
No, so the mill rates are much lower.
The mill rates are much lower. So the people that are going to get hit the hardest are people in urban areas and people in eastern Connecticut. And one of the proposals that has been talked about is to allow towns to tax people at 100% of the property value instead of the assessed value of 70%. So you're going to say that these homes that we know, in fact, they're not valued at that. You
Right.
couldn't sell them at that price. The way that property tax works in this state is you take an assessed value, which tends to be inflated, and then you can only tax them at 70%
Right.
of that assessed value. One of the proposals that's before the legislature right now is to increase it to 100%, tax them at 100% of assessed value, which is just going to be a huge tax increase to poor and middle class people.
And once again, whether you're saying you're going to tax on a higher number but a lower mill rate, or a lower number and a higher mill rate, the dollars that people are paying aren't going to go up or down depending on which way you calculate it.
That's right. Unless, of course, you're talking about a higher tax rate and a higher assessed
Right.
value, which is exactly what's going to happen. If this budget passes the way the governor has proposed it, communities all across the state, particularly poorer communities, are going to have to make huge cuts in services and huge increases in taxes. So that aid to cities and towns is cutting that is not a solution.
And I know in New London a couple weeks ago, our mayor said that no, he was giving people the potentially bad news that if state aid gets sharply reduced, our taxes could go up 6%, property taxes. And 6% when we already have a mill rate that's, I don't know what it is, close to 40. It's a lot out of people's pockets.
Right, right. And it's a lot out of people's pockets, out of people who don't have a lot of extra disposable income. And for a legislator to come back to New London and say, look, I passed a budget that your property taxes are going to go up as much as 6%, or now potentially even more if the fiscal situation is as bad as it appears to be. And the answer is because I didn't want to tax millionaires at a rate that even begins to be fair. I don't know how legislators, Republican or Democrat, can say with a straight face to their constituents, I decided to vote for a budget that raises your taxes because I didn't want to raise taxes on the wealthiest people because I was afraid that they were going to move out of state, when if they do, they'll move to a state that they would pay more in taxes. I mean, it is so absurd on its face, and yet there are all the Republicans and plenty of Democrats that are saying exactly that. And going back to this chart of where else could you cut, higher education, They are talking about another 5% cut in higher education, so that leads to higher tuition.
And friends I have who teach in the state university system, their morale has never been lower.
Yeah, yeah. And here's, we're talking about at the very time that we need the one resource that Connecticut has is its educated workforce. Yes, our labor costs are higher, our electrical costs are higher, our transportation costs are higher. We're never going to be able to compete with South Carolina when it comes to that. But one thing that we theoretically could compete with Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi is that we have a very educated workforce. So what are the state leaders talking about? They're cutting back on education at higher education. They're cutting back at the VOTEC high schools. These are the kids that are going into the very skill sets that will allow them to get jobs, to keep the economy going, to do the things that need to be done. So cutting higher education, cutting VOTechnical high schools, cutting education across the board in primary and secondary education. When you look at where we could cut, the shortfall of $2 billion out of a budget that's in the $9 to $10 billion range, and having to say, well, we got to cut one out of every $5 from that budget, it is just, it literally cannot be done. And so we're left with then having to have an adult grown-up conversation about raising taxes in an environment in which President Trump, hard to even say his name, President Trump is talking about massive tax cuts. So the fact is the rich are going to get even richer. He wants to cut the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 15%. He wants to cut the top rate on the income tax. These are wealthy people that are going to get a whole lot wealthier under Trump. And the states have to step up and say, you know what, these people can afford to pay more.
Well, there's the effect on the economy too. We know that when lower or middle income people get taxed less and they have more in their pocket, that money moves around.
That's right.
When the wealthy have more money in their pocket, it stays in their pocket. It doesn't move around. How many yachts can you buy? How many multi-million-dollar mansions can you buy? But lower income people are going to buy food, buy clothing, maybe be able to buy houses or pay rent, or that money is going to get spent and it's going to circulate in the community, whereas if it's more in the pockets of extremely wealthy people, it really just gets squirreled away somewhere.
That's right. And the idea of that trickle down economics, if we just let the rich get richer, then the rest of us will benefit. As you say, all of the evidence is exactly the opposite, and that is, if you want to stimulate the economy, you help low-income and middle-income people get access to more disposable income, because they will then use that disposable income to buy things, to do things, to go on, to do something that will get the economy moving again. And so there's all of this talk of Connecticut's economy is slower than the national average. We're behind the curve. We're not recovering the way that other states have recovered. And the answer is certainly not, well, then make the rich richer, which is exactly what our policy seems to be. I mean, from when Dan Malloy gave his first speech to the legislature, and yes, he's registered as a Democrat, he ran and won as a Democrat, but his first speech was how he didn't want to raise taxes on the wealthy because, as we said, he didn't want to punish success. Nobody's talking about punishing success. We're just talking about telling those people that they need to pay their fair share like everybody else is paying their fair share in the state.
And trickle-down economics, we know, really doesn't work as advertised, but it seems when we think about what's happening at the federal government level and the state and down into the cities, we are kind of having trickle-down deficits.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, I mean, what the trickle-down deficit of, in order to protect the rich, in order to make the rich richer, in order to keep the Wall Street people happier, we talk about all kinds of breaks that we're giving to the super elite, to the wealthy, to Wall Street. For example, one of the things that Trump is talking about is repealing the Dodd-Frank's bill. Has its that
Which
bill
actually wasn't as good as Glass-Steagall.
That's right. I was about to say. I was about to add. It's hardly the plethora of the panacea of solutions. I mean, Dodd-Frank's was a watered-down, corporate-driven concept, but at least it had some protections in place against Wall Street and against going back into the kind of crash that downed the economy in 2008 and 2009. And yet, here we are. We've got a president that says repeal that, don't replace it, don't have any protections, because the wealthy need to have free reign, and then somehow this money will trickle down. Well, what it will do by cutting those taxes, by giving those breaks, by not having protections in place, there won't be the money at the federal level. Without the money at the federal level, they're making cuts. The responsibilities will shift to the state level. The state level doesn't have the money. They're going to be making cuts. That brings the pressure down to the local level. The local level doesn't have the money. They'll be making the cuts. And so people will not have the services that they need, but the local property taxes, meantime, will go up. So they'll be paying more and getting less, while the federal government doesn't fulfill its responsibilities. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's frightening. So what can we be looking at other than a more progressive income tax rate? What other potential revenue streams are possible?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the short-term solution is, first off, to tell legislators that coming home without a solution is not acceptable. That legislators need to know, and one would hope that in the environment, in the Trump environment, Democrats would be getting a backbone and standing up for something. I mean, there's clearly, Trump did not get a majority of the vote across the country. He won because we have an antiquated electoral college system. In Connecticut, he didn't win. That this is a blue state, a Democratic state. You'd want Democrats standing up for their principles in order to stand for something that people could vote for. And so we're never going to out-Trump Trump. We Democrats, or those Democrats, are never going to out-Trump Trump. Those Democrats are never going to out-Republican the Republicans. So I think one of the messages to Democratic officials, and in fact all legislators, is don't come home without an equitable solution, because having a budget that doesn't balance, having a budget that doesn't require the wealthy to pay their fair share, a budget that makes inappropriate cuts to critical services is going to not get you reelected, then hopefully legislators across the political range will stand up and do the right thing. So in the short term, there needs to be a decision to do the right thing. That's the biggest thing.
And I was going to note that the public is standing up more than I've seen in decades. So one would think that the legislators would know what the public wants them to do.
You'd think so, yeah.
Because the public's been more vocal now since like the 60s.
That's right. That's right. And I think that, in fact, look, taxes is still a bad word, and nobody is going to say that somehow everybody is going to say raise my taxes. On the other hand, people are going to say that it's wrong to increase the burden on some people and let other people off the hook. Malloy famously said he was going to have shared sacrifice. Well, the sacrifice is all on the part of middle income and low income people. And that saying that the wealthy have to pay their fair share is not inappropriate. So that's one piece of the solution. And whether you do it as a half point, a full point, 2 points, to put the problem into perspective, it's so big now that a half a point for the wealthy, and as I said, we could raise it 2% or more, and they'd still be paying less than they would in other states.
And they could write that off on their federal income tax, right?
And they could write it off, right. And so
it
raises,
would help our return from the federal government a little bit.
That's right. So a half point raises about $200 million. So our problem is $2 billion. So a half point only is 10% of the problem. So a point would be 20% of the problem. 2 points would be 40% of the problem. The problem is so big that you really honestly have to say, we can't talk about the other parts of the solution until we first talk about getting the rich to pay their fair share. Then you have to talk about what are the other ways to do it. Well, part of it is getting rid of all of the exemptions. For example, you don't pay sales tax on public relations, but you do pay sales tax on all of the items. So if we go out and we buy something other than food, we pay a sales tax. But if you hire somebody for a public relations contract, you don't have to pay sales tax. Those kinds of loopholes, and there are a lot of industries that have gotten carved out of not having to pay their fair share, not being, you got to close those loopholes. And depending on which loopholes you could close, that would get you up to another $500 million to $1 billion. There are big,
that's actually
big loopholes.
quite a big chunk.
That's right. So the question that is, what loopholes can you close? And it's gonna, the way to probably do it is to say, we're gonna get rid of every loophole, and then to back into which loopholes have to stay. So which loopholes have to stay? Well, it's not, we would say food should not be taxed because that's a necessity. So let's not tax that, as opposed to saying which things shall we not tax. Let's go to the other extreme, say tax everything, and then which ones of those are so important that they shouldn't be taxed, like food, versus public relations or advertising or things that are not taxed. Then I think you have to look at something like taxing marijuana and say, it's coming, other states are doing it, does it make any sense for Connecticut not to have a law that Massachusetts and Maine and other states are going to have?
There is still a lot of fear, but I have to say I have visited both Oregon and Washington State in the last couple years. The sky has not fallen.
That's right.
Things really don't look much different, except you see these shops around that you can get reviews on Yelp like anything else. But in terms of like crime rates or anything, I don't think they've seen any of the disasterizing that we hear and fear-mongering that we hear from a certain segment.
That's right. And the fear-mongering and the war on drugs versus a real policy about drugs that look for policies for treatment and prevention as opposed to the war on drugs, in the long run will save us huge amounts of money. So, you know, your
incarceration is very expensive.
It's very expensive. We could send a lot of kids to college for what it takes to put one person in prison. And so there's a short-term solution, and then there's a longer-term solution. And one of the reasons to end the war on drugs and to deal with drugs for what they are is that it's a mid-term, a long-term solution to our financial crisis. And so, you know, some combination of that, and the fact is that taxes are going to go up. So the question is, what taxes and what rates? And do we think that we should, for example, if we shift the burden onto the local levels, it's going to raise the property tax. The property tax is particularly a regressive tax. If, for example, we say we shouldn't shift it to the local property tax, what revenue streams do we have? Then one of the other major revenue streams that Connecticut doesn't use that other states use is tolls. Tolls is very different. We took tolls off the roads back when everybody had to stop at the toll booth, and there were the terrible car accidents of trucks plowing into the toll booth. The fact is that
on an election year, I think, as well.
Election year, that's right. Well, you know, as we know, Massachusetts with their tolls where you don't have to stop, it's electronic tolls. We're losing a huge amount of money of people that are coming through the state, crossing state lines. The fact is that tolls are a relatively progressive way to tax because there are people that have made that decision for whatever reason to work out of state or to travel in and out of state, plus all of the people that are just traveling through during the summer and other months where they're using our roads, but they're not paying any of the costs of our roads. So if you put right now we use tax money to subsidize transportation. If we had tolls and we use those for road improvement, that would reduce the pressure on our tax structure.
And the technology has made it much easier. The last time we drove, I don't know, to Maryland or Pennsylvania, coming back on the Tappan Zee Bridge, now there's no toll booth. You either have Easy Pass, or if you don't, they take a picture and they send you a bill. And I think it costs you a couple bucks more if you get pay the toll that way than if you have an Easy Pass.
Right.
But no one has to stop.
And nobody has to stop. And you look at the number of Connecticut cars that have Easy Pass, have the little
They have
Easy
them
Pass.
already.
That's right. And they're using them in New York, and they're using them in Massachusetts, and those states are collecting. Our people are paying that when they go to New York and Massachusetts, but New York people are not paying when they come to Connecticut, and Massachusetts people aren't paying when they come to Connecticut. And so it's sort of, if you start out by saying we need to come up with $2 billion in order to preserve what we consider to be the vital services that government should be functioning. It should actually be doing more, but in this kind of economic environment, here's what we think we need in order to preserve vital services. Now, how do we raise $2 billion? That's a very different kind of discussion, and there are solutions out there. None of them, some of them are not easy solutions. Some of them don't have widespread, overwhelming popularity, but I think that there are solutions out there that the majority of people in Connecticut would support, whether it's increasing the tax on those who can afford to pay, whether it's closing the loopholes for services that should be taxed that aren't. The marijuana taxation, the tolls, would all put together a revenue stream that would allow us to maintain vital services.
Now, I know we don't have a huge amount of time, but I did want to not totally leave out education funding and what's happening with the CJEF case and the repercussions from it, and the education cost-sharing formula that's been being looked at. Are we seeing good trends or bad trends? Or?
Well, we're seeing potentially bad trends. If there's a nugget of silver lining in the fiscal chaos, is that the solution to Connecticut's school funding formula is to do what's called a cost adequacy study. That's what 30 other states have done. That's what Connecticut needs to do. Before we can design the future, we need to determine what do schools really need to do the job right. What the judge said in the CJEF case was that the formula that Connecticut has is irrational. It doesn't make sense.
It didn't start out irrational.
It started
correct?
out as a very rational system. When it was adopted in 1986, the educational cost-sharing formula made a lot of sense. It shifted money to poorer towns. It gave wealthier towns a small amount of money. It gave poorer towns much better money. And then politics got in the way over the last 30 years, 40 years, to the point that it's now an irrational system. But one of the things that we don't have is how much should Connecticut be spending, and then we can decide how much should be a state responsibility, how much a local responsibility, how much do we want to help poor towns, how much do wealthy towns need support too. So what needs to happen is to take the year or 2 years, over the next 2 years, do a real cost adequacy study, determine what is needed, and then design a formula. But because people are trying to grab money now, there are some very bad proposals. In fact, there's just a proposal that's come out from the state Senate, which would actually divert even more money to charter schools, because the charter schools are trying to use this chaos to grab more money. We already spend $110 million a year to fund these privately owned and operated charter schools. Governor Malloy has called for a 10% increase in funding for charter schools this year.
Do you think he'll get it?
I'm hopeful that in this kind of economic chaos, that people will say, you can't be giving the charter schools 10% more. Everybody else is being cut. There's no reason to give the charter schools more, and let alone this new proposal, which would give them even more money. So I'm hoping that cooler heads will prevail. They'll focus on balancing the budget. Then they'll come back and do the kind of education cost study and a cost-sharing formula that makes sense.
So what should the people who are watching be communicating to their legislators?
Well, right, that's an excellent question, and a way to sort of cap off everything is call your legislators now and tell them pass a responsible budget that makes sure that everybody pays their fair share. And that includes reducing the amount of cuts and increasing the amount of revenue, and make sure that the revenue is coming from those that can afford to pay. And secondly, don't do something stupid on education. Do the right thing on education, and that means doing the kind of analysis, how much money does education need, and then coming up with a system to come up with that money and distribute that money. So if you ask those legislators to do two things, pass a balanced and fair budget, and do what's necessary on education by doing a cost adequacy study, then those are two things that they could do if they would put their mind to it.
And then remind them that when the session ends, they'll be walking around town and bumping into you.
That's right, and that elections are not far off.
Never. Well, you know, about a week ago, we showed a film here of Noam Chomsky's Requiem for the American Dream. And I just want to kind of end with one paraphrase of a quote from that movie. We purposely showed it on tax day, this year's tax day. And his statement was that in a democratic society, tax day should be a day of celebration, because that's when a community gets together and figures out what the priorities are and figures out how to fund those priorities. And the fact that we don't celebrate tax day means something's wrong. Mm-hmm. So I think we're out of time for now. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.